Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instructions series on writing a great research paper. This is the fourth program in the series. So far, we've walked you through the process of defining a specific topic based on the general subject your teacher has assigned. We've shown you how to create a working hypothesis to focus on in your research and in the paper itself. And we've demonstrated the techniques you need to use when doing in-depth research, whether using traditional library sources or materials you find online using the internet. By now, you've probably uncovered an enormous wealth of materials that may be relevant to your paper. It may include books, articles in scholarly journals or in newspapers or magazines, graphic and visual materials like maps, charts, tables, diagrams, photographs, and paintings, and online sources such as web pages from organizations, individuals, universities, and others with interest in your topic. Now you face the next challenge, figuring out which of these materials are truly relevant and useful and which should be avoided, ignored, or considered with a skeptical eye. And once you've navigated these tricky waters, you also need to know how to use the materials you've selected so as to avoid plagiarism and other pitfalls that can ruin your reputation as a student while earning you a failing grade on your paper and perhaps the entire course. As you can see, the topics we'll be discussing in this program are some of the most important in the whole series, not just for the paper you're writing now, but for your entire academic career. So, let's get started. As we've discussed elsewhere in this series, the internet is evolving into a kind of universal library where much of the world's knowledge will be available conveniently to you wherever you can get access to a computer. But at the present time, this evolution is incomplete. That means that the internet contains some, but not all, of the information you might need for a research project. What's more, the information that is available on the internet is badly disorganized. Materials that are useful, relevant, truthful, unbiased, complete, and well-organized appear on the web alongside materials that are confusing, inaccurate, dishonest, biased, incomplete, and disorganized. It's up to you to figure out which are which. Now, public or school libraries are better sources than the internet in one sense because the materials they contain have all been selected by professionals, librarians who are trained to distinguish useful materials from those that are not so useful. But even libraries may contain books, articles, and other materials that need to be handled with care. For example, not all libraries are well funded, which means that some contain books that are badly dated. You need to carefully evaluate materials from the library, too, before relying on them in your paper. Here are some tips about how to separate the best research sources from those that are not so good. Among the criteria to consider are the following. First, comprehensibility. Don't try to use a book or article as a source for your paper unless you really understand what it says. Now, this doesn't mean you should only use easy sources. Use a dictionary, of course, to help with hard language, and as you spend time reading around your topic, you may find yourself understanding more and more complex materials. So some books or articles that may seem difficult to understand at the beginning of your research project may become easier and more understandable the longer you work on that topic. But if you're still stymied by a particular work that seems to be very technical or advanced, don't try to cite it as a source in your paper. You may end up making yourself look silly by misconstruing the information provided there and making the article or the book appear to be saying something that it really didn't say. So unless you really understand what you're reading, don't try to rely on that as a source for your paper. That's why comprehensibility is the first important criterion in choosing research sources to rely upon. A second important criterion is timeliness. All things being equal, more recent sources are better than older ones. This is especially true in fields like the natural sciences, math, and the social sciences, where research is constantly going on and is continually producing new insights and theories that make old ideas obsolete. Now, in the humanities and history, older works may still be relevant. So I suggest asking your teacher for a guideline. Should you look at any works older than 10 years or 20 years, or is some other cutoff date appropriate? Depending on the specific field and the topic you're writing about, the cutoff date may vary. A third important criterion is the reputation of the source. This refers in the first place to the author's reputation. The book or article that you're considering using as a reference source is written by a particular person or group of people, and the reputation of the author makes a big difference as to whether that work is one that you should rely upon. You can check the author's reputation in a number of ways. One way is to do an internet search that shows how the author has been discussed or referred to by others. You can also notice where an author works. An author who is a professor at an excellent university is probably a more reliable source than one from a lesser school or someone with no particular academic or scholarly credentials. Now, the reputation of the source also includes the reputation of the periodical or of the book publisher. For example, a scholarly journal that almost every university library subscribes to is likely to publish reliable articles. A journal that very few schools carry will publish less useful work. So try to get a sense as to how widespread the particular journal is, and that will help you determine whether the materials they publish can be relied upon or not. The book publisher can also give you a clue as to whether a book is worth relying on or not. Most university press books have been vetted for accuracy by committees of scholars, while books that are published by ordinary commercial houses may be less reliable. These are some of the things to consider when judging the reputation of the source. Here's another important criterion in deciding whether a particular source is worth relying upon. That's apparent bias. If a book or article takes a strong point of view that appears to be very different from what's offered in most other sources, you may be encountering an example of bias. You may have an author who is slanting the information in order to support a particular point of view, which may or may not mean accuracy. For example, most mainstream historians and writers would offer both positive and negative judgments about civil rights figures like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. These are important figures from history who have been widely studied, and there's a body of mainstream opinion about these leaders that includes both positive and negative ideas, all of which could be considered quite mainstream and respectable in the academic worlds. On the other hand, if you come across a book or article dealing with these figures that seems to describe all civil rights leaders as communists, or that devotes half of its length to describing their marital troubles or their drinking habits, you're probably looking at a book written by someone with a strong anti-civil rights bias, and you may want to question whether to use that book or article as a source for your paper. By the same token, if you read a book or article that assumes that government leaders like President Johnson personally ordered the murders of Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, which is something that no mainstream historian believes, you're probably looking at a book with a strong bias against the white leadership of the country. And obviously that kind of bias would be equally bad as a strong bias against the civil rights leaders. So when you encounter a book or an article that contains extreme opinions like these, which are not generally accepted by mainstream scholars or thinkers, proceed with caution. Chances are good you're running up against an author with a strong bias for or against the topic, someone who is cherry-picking facts and ideas in order to support a particular point of view, regardless of whether it corresponds to the truth. Also consider the nature of the work. In other words, look through the book or article with certain criteria in mind to see whether it gives the impression of being scholarly, serious, thoughtful, and reliable or not. Here are some of the things to think about. Does the work contain clear and thorough scholarly reference material? In other words, footnotes and a bibliography that tell the sources from which the author has derived his or her ideas and facts. Does the work refer to the mainstream works of other writers in the field? Is the work long enough to cover its topic in a serious, thoughtful fashion? Or is it a very brief, dashed-off, quick summary of the topic, and therefore perhaps not covering the material in very much depth? Does it contain a thorough, detailed index that makes it easy to find specific topics within the book? What do the acknowledgments or the preface say about the nature of the research that was done in preparing the book? Does the book sound as though it was done in a slipshod, hasty fashion, or did a lot of background work go into creating it? Finally, consider what others say about the work. Again, an internet search can help you discover what other scholars, critics, or writers have said about the authors or specific sources you're considering using. You can also check what's written about a book or article in an annotated bibliography for your topic area. As we discussed in another program, an annotated bibliography would give a complete list of important books and articles dealing with a particular subject or topic. And an annotated bibliography includes a brief evaluation and description of each work that's listed. And you can usually get a sense from an annotated bibliography as to whether a particular article or book is valuable, reliable, and useful, or whether it is not considered that highly by scholars in the field. There's also a useful reference work called Book Review Digest, which is available partly online and partly in bound volumes in your school or public library. And this contains excerpts from reviews of books that appeared during the year the book was published. If you're wondering how experts reacted to a specific book when it was first released, you can look it up in Book Review Digest. And you can also sometimes find book review excerpts on the websites of booksellers such as Amazon.com. Now, here's an example of how you might use all these criteria to evaluate a book when deciding whether or not to rely upon it as a research source. We visited our local library to research the topic of how Malcolm X's attitudes toward integration shifted in the later years of his life. And as part of our research project, we wanted to find a good, comprehensive biography of Malcolm that we could read to put the evolution of Malcolm's thinking into a broad, lifetime perspective. In that search, we found this book, Malcolm, The Life of a Man Who Changed Black America, written by an author named Bruce Perry. How can we determine whether or not this book is a reliable source? Let's apply some of the criteria we just described. First, let's consider the reputation of the source. The author is described on the book cover as a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania who has taught political science in the University of Texas system, the University of Pennsylvania, and other colleges. Now, this is a good set of credentials, though not great. The University of Pennsylvania is a fine university, and so the fact that the author has a PhD from that university, that's fairly impressive. However, we notice that he is not a tenured professor on the faculty of a leading university, but rather that he has taught political science in a number of colleges. So that suggests that the author, Bruce Perry, has a pretty good academic career, but he's not considered one of the stars of his field. The book is published by a publisher called Station Hill Press. Now, this is not a university press, which means that this is probably not a book that was vetted or reviewed by a committee of expert scholars before it was published. And Station Hill Press is not a particularly well-known publisher. It's not one of the best-known commercial publishers like Random House, Simon & Schuster, or HarperCollins. So, therefore, the nature of the publisher is not terribly impressive, and that doesn't strengthen the author's or the book's case. Now let's analyze the book itself. It's long enough to be pretty thorough, well over 500 pages. So that suggests that quite a bit of work went into creating the book, and that's a good sign. It does contain detailed scholarly sources, including over 100 pages of footnotes, an 11-page bibliography, and a 9-page list of people whom the author interviewed, including friends and colleagues and family members of Malcolm X. So it seems that the author did a very thorough job of researching the book. The existence of these items in themselves doesn't necessarily prove that the book is a serious scholarly piece of work, but it suggests that the author is at least trying to do a reputable job of researching and analyzing his topic. Now, the book was published in the year 1992, which means it's not extremely recent, but it's probably recent enough to be useful. So our evaluation of the contents of the book gives us a fairly positive picture. Again, not necessarily decisive, but it looks pretty good as far as we can tell so far. Finally, what about the issue of bias? Now, without having read the book, we can probably tell something about any possible bias that the author or the book may reflect by looking at what others have said about the book. The topic of the book is a controversial one. As you probably know, Malcolm X is a controversial civil rights figure about whom some have positive feelings, some negative, and others with very mixed opinions about his life, work, and ideology. So it's likely that any strong bias that the author shows either for or against Malcolm X would probably be mentioned in reviews and other comments that were published around the time the book itself was first issued. If this author is very strongly anti-Malcolm X, very strongly pro-Malcolm X, or if he has some very unusual slant or point of view, chances are good that reviewers of the book would have mentioned that when the book was published. Luckily, we can find excerpts from the reviews of this book online. Now, it's a good sign that most of the major periodicals that review books published a review of this one. When we searched online, we found that there were excerpts from reviews of this book published in magazines such as Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, and major newspapers such as the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. The fact that the book was widely reviewed when it was published suggests that it's a serious book that was considered important by editors at the time the book was published. So that's a good sign as to the seriousness and importance and mainstream status of the book. Now, what did these reviews say? Here we find an interesting pattern. The review from School Library Journal said the following about this book. After 18 years of meticulous research and gathering oral and written observations of over 400 people who knew Malcolm X, Perry has produced a sensitive biography that chronicles the entire life of this heroic figure. This book will change how readers see Malcolm, and because of that, it will be controversial. Okay, that's what School Library Journal said about the book. Now, you can see that parts of this review are extremely positive. It talks about 18 years of meticulous research, 400 people that were interviewed or who wrote items for Perry to analyze about Malcolm X, and it describes the book as a sensitive biography that chronicles the entire life of this heroic figure. All of that is very positive and suggests that this may be a very good source, that the material and information provided here would be quite reliable. The last sentence of the School Library Journal review, however, says that the book will change how readers see Malcolm, and because of that, it will be controversial. Okay, that means that not everyone who read this book would agree with the point of view about Malcolm X. Some people would feel strongly positive about the book. Others are likely to feel strongly negative about it. This particular review doesn't go into any detail about what exactly is controversial, so let's read on and see if any other review gives us any further clues as to what exactly is controversial about this book. In Library Journal, we see the following sentences from the review of this same book. In a psychohistorical analysis resembling William McFeely's recent rendition of Frederick Douglass, Perry traces Malcolm X's footsteps from birth in 1925 to death in 1965, using several hundred interviews to fill in detail and correct the autobiography Alex Haley edited. Probing what he labels as the deep-seated and hidden causes that made Malcolm who and what he was, Perry produces a portrait of an emotionally abused and abandoned boy who grew to manipulate his fearful helplessness into emotional and political power. Scholars at whom the book seems aimed may find some of the information useful, though they will have to skirt the occasionally simplistic interpretation, an optional purchase for academic collections. Okay, let's analyze what Library Journal is saying in this review. First, they describe the kind of book it is. It's a psychohistorical analysis, and it talks about the extensive research that the author Perry did, the several hundred interviews that were used to fill in and correct the autobiography Alex Haley edited. If you've been researching the life of Malcolm X, you know that he published an autobiography which was edited by a writer named Alex Haley, who helped him prepare the book. And we notice that Library Journal then goes on to describe in some detail the particular point of view of Perry's book, probing what he labels as the deep-seated and hidden causes that made Malcolm who and what he was. Perry produces a portrait of an emotionally abused and abandoned boy. We can see what the author of this review means by psychohistorical. This is a book which spends a lot of its time dealing with the inner turmoil and the personality conflicts of Malcolm X, the problems he had with his family, and so forth. So this sounds as though this is an attempt to psychoanalyze Malcolm X, to understand the deep-rooted emotional and psychological difficulties that made him what he was, as opposed to analyzing his place perhaps in political or philosophical history, thinking about him as a black leader. It's much more about the deep-seated personal problems that Malcolm X might have had. And we can begin to see what might be controversial about this book. Perhaps people who are profound admirers of Malcolm X might find it troubling that this particular author focuses primarily on how Malcolm X was abused and abandoned as a child. Those are negative aspects of his life that perhaps might call into question the value of some of Malcolm X's philosophies. Finally, in the end of the Library Journal review, we note that there are a couple of negative words stated about the book, that scholars may have to skirt the occasionally simplistic interpretation. Simplistic means overly simplified, and the author of this particular review found that some of the opinions expressed by the author in the book are a little bit too simple, that they make Malcolm X's life appear a little bit too easy to understand, that he didn't capture some of the complexities behind Malcolm X's life and ideas. So if you decide to go ahead and use this book as part of your own research project, you'd have to be careful and watch out for ideas that scholars might consider simplistic. Don't necessarily take this book at face value, in other words. Finally, Library Journal says that this is an optional purchase for an academic collection. One of the purposes of a review journal like Library Journal is to give librarians advice as to which books must be purchased for any good library and which ones aren't so necessary. In this case, they say that the book would be an optional purchase, not a book that any good library ought to own, but one that some libraries that have the money and the space and that perhaps have a special interest in civil rights or black issues would be particularly interested in owning. So we can tell from these reviews that the book's author probably doesn't have a particular axe to grind. He's not strongly anti-Malcolm X, nor is he strongly pro-Malcolm X. And the book has been thoroughly researched. All of those are good things. But the book clearly takes a particular point of view which is somewhat out of the mainstream and therefore controversial. It focuses primarily on Malcolm's inner mental states and not so much on his philosophy. Based on this information, I would probably classify this book as a maybe, perhaps worth reading in sections, particularly in the parts that focus particularly on our topic, that is, how Malcolm's philosophy evolved in the last years of his life. But it's probably not a good basic source for our study of Malcolm's philosophy. So this is an example of how you would use available information sources, as well as your analysis of the book itself, to determine whether a particular work is worth relying upon as a research source. What's the moral? Well, in your research, you're going to encounter a vast assortment of materials, both in the library and online. And the task of choosing which items are worth relying on takes quite a bit of judgment and practice. Remember that a few high-quality sources are going to be better than a large mass of junk. So be selective about the sources that you rely upon as you do your research. Almost every teacher who assigns a research paper warns the students about the dangers of plagiarism. Most high schools, colleges, and universities have strict written policies about plagiarism. For a first offense, you'll almost certainly receive a grade of F on the assignment. You may also be given a failing grade on the course. And if you commit plagiarism repeatedly, you may even be subject to suspension or expulsion from school. In any case, if you commit plagiarism even once, your reputation as a student and as a person of integrity will be seriously damaged. Any teacher or advisor who hears about your mistake will probably refuse to write a letter of recommendation that you might need later for a future school or job application. And charges of plagiarism can haunt a person for a lifetime or even beyond. So obviously, plagiarism is something you don't want to do or even come close to doing. But what is plagiarism? Teachers who warn their students to avoid plagiarism don't always explain in detail what plagiarism is and how to avoid it. As a result, some students commit plagiarism by accident, simply because they don't understand what's involved and because they're confused about what is and isn't allowed in the world of scholarship. In the next few minutes, we'll cover the topic in detail. Remember, you can't get away with plagiarism by claiming you didn't understand the rules. First, let's recall the definition of a research paper that we offered in the first program in this series. A research paper is a paper that presents an original approach to some academic topic, organized around a central thesis, using insights based on research, and citing sources in a scholarly fashion. The third point in this definition leads to some confusion on the part of students and helps to make plagiarism more likely. Yes, as that third point suggests, your paper will use insights based on research, which means that you will borrow facts and ideas that you come across in your reading. But this must be put in the context of the other 3 points of our definition. Remember what those are. Your paper must present an original approach to the topic. In other words, you must come up with your own way of looking at the topic, rather than simply echoing a point of view that you found somewhere else. Remember also, your paper must be organized around a central thesis, which means that you must develop your own main idea for the paper, and that will determine what is and isn't included in the paper, rather than simply copying facts from your research. And your paper must cite sources in a scholarly fashion, which means following standard rules and procedures to explain where you found the facts and ideas that you're borrowing. Now, in this program and elsewhere in the series, we'll explain the scholarly process for citing sources in detail. But the key concept is to realize that a research paper must be basically your own work and must use facts and ideas from research simply to back up and support your original concepts. And whenever you do use facts and ideas borrowed from research sources, you need to explain and acknowledge those sources rather than let readers get the impression that you came up with the facts and ideas completely on your own. That's the bright dividing line between plagiarism and research. If you understand these basic ground rules about scholarly work and take them seriously, you probably won't find yourself committing plagiarism inadvertently. Plagiarism is a kind of theft, and theft, of course, comes in many varieties. When you accidentally walk out of a store and forget to pay for a pack of gum, well, that's technically a kind of theft. So is hotwiring someone's car so you can steal it and sell it for parts, and so is hacking a computer system of a bank so you can get your hands on millions of dollars in the bank accounts. Plagiarism also takes many forms, and they vary in terms of culpability, just as these kinds of theft do. Let's review the different types of plagiarism so you can understand better how to avoid them. First, buying, borrowing, or reusing a paper is plagiarism. As you've probably heard, there are people who will write research papers for other students for a fee. And there are even companies that provide such services on a large scale to hundreds or thousands of students every year. Some of these companies disguise their offerings by calling themselves research services. But no matter what you call it, when you buy from someone else the research and writing work that you've been assigned to do by your teacher, you're committing plagiarism. It's also plagiarism even when no money changes hands. So if you talk your best friend into writing a paper for you, or if you take a paper that your brother or sister or cousin wrote for a similar class and put your name on it, or if you take pages from someone else's paper and stick them into your own, all of these are forms of plagiarism, theft, and you can get into a lot of trouble for doing them. Now, what about reusing a paper that you wrote for another class? That's probably not technically plagiarism, since you can't really steal from yourself, but it is a breach of scholarly ethics, since you're trying to get credit twice for work that you did once, and you will get into serious trouble with your teacher and your school if it's discovered. So whenever you're assigned a paper for a class, take seriously the obligation. You are required to do a fresh piece of research and writing, to do it on your own, and to produce it all through your own efforts. Anything short of that is plagiarism or is some other form of scholarly crime. Next, claiming as your own a piece of writing from a published source is also plagiarism. Now, this means, of course, that if you copy an article from an encyclopedia, a journal, a magazine, or an anthology and attach your name to it, you're committing plagiarism. But remember, nowadays, the word publishing doesn't only mean something that is printed in book or magazine form and that you can read in hard copy. Publishing also refers to the act of posting an item on the internet. Anything that is on the internet is technically published, and therefore claiming that work as your own is also plagiarism. This means that grabbing a piece of writing, a paragraph or a page from the World Wide Web, and claiming it as your own, sticking it into a paper and putting your name on it, is just as much an act of plagiarism as copying work that you find in a book or a magazine. Please don't be misled by the fact that computer technology nowadays makes it incredibly fast and easy to cut and paste materials from the internet and present them as your own work. And don't be misled by the fact that some websites allow or even encourage web surfers to link to or copy or disseminate their materials. Some proprietors of websites are eager to have their information and ideas spread to others, and so they allow you to freely cut and paste their materials. However, within the academic context, it is still plagiarism to take those materials and use them, even if the owner of the website doesn't mind. It's plagiarism whenever you say that you wrote something that you didn't write, no matter where you find it. Now, it's also plagiarism to quote words, sentences, paragraphs, or pages from another writer's work without giving that writer credit. Again, the use of technology to cut and paste materials from published sources leads many people astray. It's so easy now to grab a few words or sentences from something that you read online and stick it into your own paper that it's easy to think of it as perfectly innocent or even commendable. After all, isn't that research? Well, the answer is no, that's not research. When you borrow words, phrases, or sentences from another writer, you have to put them inside quotation marks in your paper and tell the reader clearly where they come from. If you don't do that, you're committing plagiarism. There have been well-known and highly respected historians who in recent years have gotten into trouble with the public, with their fellow scholars, and with their publishers for inadvertently committing plagiarism. They did a lot of cutting and pasting when they were in the research phase of working on particular book projects and ended up with large files filled with quotations from the internet, from other sources, from books and articles that they found online and which were useful for them in formulating their own ideas. However, in maintaining their research files, these authors failed to clearly distinguish for their own purposes which materials they'd borrowed and which ones they'd written. And some of those borrowed paragraphs ended up appearing in published books, which created no end of headache and heartache for those authors. So when you do cut and paste materials from the internet so that you can read them later and either print them out on a hard copy or keep them in a file in your computer, make sure that you put quotation marks around them and clearly label on the same page exactly where those materials came from, who the author was, and all the bibliographic information about the published source. That will make it very hard for you to inadvertently or accidentally pluck one of those sentences or paragraphs or pages and stick it into your paper without realizing that you didn't write it. Finally, it's plagiarism to copy another writer's sequence of ideas without giving that writer credit. This is true even if every single word in the source material is changed in your own paper. Here's an example. Let's say you're researching the topic of how the invention of recording technology influenced the production and enjoyment of music. Now, in the course of your research, you read many interesting books and articles about this topic, and you discover one article in a scholarly journal that is particularly interesting to you. The article explains how Thomas Edison, the inventor of the phonograph, believed that his new device would make it possible to preserve sounds for all ages, including many varieties of music that might otherwise be forgotten and vanish from the scene. The article goes on to say that in the early years of the 20th century, musicians and scholars of music such as Bela Bartok, Zoltan Kodaly, and Percy Grainger used the new phonographic technology to preserve the voices of elderly folk singers from around the world whose timeless ways were being stamped out by the advance of modern life. And what was helping to stamp out these ancient forms of music? Well, the phonograph, which was making possible the production of millions of copies of international hit tunes that were being sold around the world. So in a very ironic and interesting way, the phonograph was playing a dual role in the history of folk music. On the one hand, it was helping to preserve early forms of folk music in recorded form so that people of future generations could listen to this music even after the original singers had died out. And yet, by the same token, the phonograph was also helping to destroy these native traditions of folk music, because by making mass-produced hit records possible and making them available around the world, it meant that people in all these countries around the globe were buying up hit songs produced in the United States or in other Western countries rather than listening to and supporting their traditional folk music. So the phonograph was playing both a destructive and a preservative role in the history of folk music. All of this you read in a very interesting journal article that you find while doing your research. It's a fascinating story, and you might well want to borrow some ideas and facts from this paper in your own paper. Here's the danger. If you model your paper on the one you've read and describe the same historical events involving Edison and the historians and musicians like Bela Bartok and Percy Grainger, if you describe these same events in the same order, using the same details in your paper, you are guilty of plagiarism, even if you rewrite every sentence so that your paper doesn't contain the same words as the original paper. You may not be stealing the first author's words, but you're stealing his ideas and his research, which is just as bad. What's the solution? Does this mean that it's not safe to refer to that article and to quote some of the ideas and facts and stories that are told in that article? Not at all. What it does mean, though, is that you need to keep reading and thinking and find a way to expand, extend, or connect the author's ideas to some other aspects of your topic. Remember what we said, your research paper needs to be your own work organized by you around ideas that you originated. So you need to continue to develop the theme and the topic in some unique and fresh way rather than simply copying what the other author has said. For example, maybe you can research and discover other examples of how the phonograph was used to preserve early forms of music. Maybe you can discover how folk musicians themselves used sound recording to spread their music to new audiences. What happened to those recordings made by people like Percy Grainger? Did they become hits in themselves? Maybe you can investigate how popular music sold through recordings actually influenced new forms of folk music over the last century. In other words, rather than simply copying the interesting work done by the previous writer, develop your own approach to the topic. Then you can use the information and ideas that you borrow from the previous writer as part of your paper without making your paper simply a regurgitation or a repetition of what the original writer did. And of course, when you do borrow some of those ideas or details from the previous article, you want to include a footnote and a bibliographic reference explaining what the other work was that you're borrowing from and giving due credit to the original author. But this is an example of how borrowing too closely from the ideas and the presentation of a previous writer can lead to plagiarism, even if you're not literally copying words, phrases, or sentences or paragraphs from the previous piece. Maybe this example makes you nervous. Is it possible to commit plagiarism unintentionally if you simply mention facts that another writer has mentioned? Here's an example of this danger. Suppose you were writing a paper about the assassination of President Lincoln. Now, there are certain facts that practically any book or article on this topic would probably mention. Certain basic facts such as the date on which the assassination occurred, the fact that Lincoln was shot by an avid supporter of the Confederate States in the Civil War, which was nearing an end at that time, or the fact that his murder was part of a conspiracy among several people who hoped to kill not just Lincoln, but also his Secretary of State and other high government officials. All of these are basic facts which are going to be mentioned in any article or book about Lincoln and his assassination. Now, perhaps you're wondering, would it be plagiarism if you mentioned these facts without citing a specific source? After all, your teacher could point to another book and say, well, all those same facts are here, so therefore you must have plagiarized. Well, the answer is no. It wouldn't be plagiarism to mention these facts because they fall into a special category known as common knowledge. These are concepts that are so widely recognized that it's unnecessary to refer to any specific source when you mention them. Okay, how do you decide what is or isn't common knowledge? In some cases, it's obvious. One test is how easy it would be to verify a particular fact from generally available sources of information. Here's an example. The fact that a mile is 5,280 feet long is something that you could check in practically any dictionary or encyclopedia or almanac or any other reference source. And therefore, you can consider this fact common knowledge. If you were to mention it in a paper, there'd be no need to give a footnote or reference as to where you got that fact from. Now, what about those facts about the Lincoln assassination? As I said, they would appear in virtually any biography of Lincoln or history of the Civil War era. You really can't describe Lincoln's assassination without mentioning these basic facts. So therefore, these two would be considered common knowledge. Anyone who knows anything about Lincoln or his assassination or the Civil War would know these basic facts. Some ideas are so widely discussed and generally known that they can also be considered common knowledge, talking now about ideas or concepts rather than hard facts. Here's an example of how an idea can be considered common knowledge. Let's think about Herman Melville's classic novel, Moby Dick. Now, in this book, as you may know, the whaler, Captain Ahab, becomes obsessed with finding and killing the giant, fierce white whale, Moby Dick. Ahab pursues this goal throughout the book until he's finally destroyed in his attempt to capture Moby Dick. Now, from the moment Melville published this book back in the 19th century, it was obvious to people that one possible symbolic meaning of the story was that Captain Ahab, with his obsession, represents anyone who becomes obsessed with achieving some kind of grand goal. In this reading of the book, Moby Dick, the whale, symbolizes any goal that is hard to obtain and that ultimately destroys the person who seeks it. And we've all seen examples in real life, even in your own life perhaps, of someone who gets so obsessed with a particular goal that they pursue it even to the point where it damages themselves personally. And that would be a very typical symbolic reading of the book Moby Dick. So practically anyone who reads Moby Dick will recognize this as part of the book's meaning. The whole idea of obsession is at the very core of the book. I'm sure that it would be possible to find one or more specific literary critics who mention this idea when they write about Moby Dick. In fact, you could probably find dozens of them because it is so obvious and basic. But if you were writing a research paper about Moby Dick and you wanted to talk about this idea that Moby Dick represents an obsession that a person may have, it really wouldn't be necessary to cite a source for this idea. It's so common and it's so obvious that it doesn't really need citation. Here then is a rule of thumb that you can use to help you determine in any gray instance whether a particular fact or concept should be considered common knowledge or not. If, in the course of your research, you encounter the same fact or idea in at least 3 separate sources, you can consider it common knowledge, and there's probably no need to mention a specific source when you refer to this fact or idea in your paper. However, if you only encounter a particular fact or idea in 1 or 2 sources, then it's probably not common knowledge, and the safe thing to do would be to cite a source when you mention that fact or idea. When in doubt, go ahead and give a citation. The worst thing that can happen is that your teacher will tell you, oh, that particular footnote wasn't really necessary. That could be considered common knowledge, and you'll have learned something in the experience. It's much better to lean over backward and give an extra footnote or 2 for a piece of information that you think may or may not be common knowledge, rather than to err in the other direction and inadvertently commit plagiarism. You see then that plagiarism doesn't refer only to the act of quoting the actual words of another writer without mentioning the source. It can also refer to mentioning facts or ideas without naming their source, depending on whether or not those facts or ideas qualify as common knowledge. So understanding this concept of common knowledge and practicing applying it is part of the art of scholarship and part of what's necessary to write a great research paper. One more point about plagiarism. You may be wondering how your teacher can actually detect plagiarism in a research paper. After all, it's not possible for a teacher to have read every single book or article about a given topic, no matter how old your teacher may be and how long he or she may have been studying the field. You may even know someone who bought or stole a paper or copied large chunks of a book or article and turned them in as their own original research and got away with it. And this does happen from time to time. And this might tempt you to try to do the same, especially if you're getting near the deadline to hand in a particular paper and you're afraid that you haven't got the time or energy to finish the job. Late at night, you may think, oh, maybe I can get away with it just this month. Take my word, it's really not worth the risk. You'd be surprised how easy it is in most cases for teachers to spot plagiarism. Most students write very differently from the professionals whose work appears in books, articles, or online. And the chances are good that any material you steal from another source is going to stand out from the rest of your work, which will raise suspicions in the mind of your teacher. And nowadays, the speed with which search engines can scour the internet looking for particular words and phrases actually makes it quite easy for someone to locate the source of a particular passage or document that appears suspicious. So if your teacher thinks you might have committed plagiarism, he or she can actually use the internet to track down the original source, compare the two, and quickly see what you've stolen and where. So the same technology that makes it easy to plagiarize also makes it harder to hide your plagiarism. In fact, teachers have even banded together and created some websites specifically devoted to helping them spot and uncover cases of plagiarism. So teachers are on the march against plagiarism, and it's quite hard to get away with it nowadays. As for buying a paper written by some other student or by one of the services, this, too, I have to say, is a bad idea. Most of the papers that are sold online aren't really very good, and there are many stories of students who spend hundreds of dollars to buy papers that end up earning them a grade of C or D, which strikes me as a real waste of money. And furthermore, most ready-made papers that are sold on the internet or elsewhere won't actually fit your assigned subject very well, which will further help to arouse your teacher's suspicion. So even aside from the fact that plagiarizing is not a good thing to do and it's only going to take away your opportunity to learn something from the experience of writing the paper, even aside from all of those ethical considerations, plagiarizing doesn't make a lot of sense even from a practical standpoint. I would avoid it if I were you, and I hope that the tips that we've provided in the last few minutes will make it easy for you to do that. Here are some other points related to academic integrity that everyone writing a research paper should be aware of and should be thinking about. These are rules of scholarly behavior that don't deal with plagiarism, but that are also important to follow if you want to earn a high grade on your paper and also be considered a person of integrity. First, you should, of course, resist the temptation to fake research. If you're running out of time when you're working on your paper, the idea may occur to you to put in a few fake footnotes or references into your bibliography. Making up the name of an article or a book or two may seem a lot faster and easier than actually finding real articles or books and reading them and incorporating them into your writing. However, like plagiarism, this is a very bad idea. It's actually harder than you may think to make up authors and titles that sound truly plausible. And again, the advent of the internet makes it all too easy for a teacher to double-check your research by looking up one or all of the sources you mention. Most teachers will not devote the time and energy to checking the sources referred to by every student in every paper, but many teachers do make a habit of spot checking, that is, going to the internet to check one or two or three of your sources. And if they happen to stumble upon one that you've made up or which does not actually refer to the topic in question, that will make them challenge everything in your paper, scrutinize it all quite carefully, and probably any fakery that you've included anywhere in the paper will quickly be exposed, leading inevitably to a grade of F on the paper. So it's really not worth taking the risk. You might get away with this form of fraud, but believe me, it's not a chance that's worth taking. The same, of course, applies to faking other kinds of research. For example, faking or fabricating the results of experiments in a science class. It's always regarded as a very serious offense, and if it's discovered, you can be sure that any chance you have of pursuing higher academic studies in that particular field will be gone forever. And in addition, it's quite likely that the offense will be recorded in your permanent school records. It will jeopardize the kinds of recommendations and referrals that you get from your professors later. So again, it may be tempting when midnight approaches and your paper is due the next day, but just buckle down and do the work rather than faking or making up the results. You'll find that you're courting real danger if you do that. Another scholarly crime consists of misrepresenting, distorting, or spinning the contents of someone else's work. For example, let's suppose that you find in some well-respected book or article a passage or a collection of facts that almost supports the main point you're trying to make in your paper, but doesn't quite support it. Instead, let's say that this passage or the collection of facts lend partial support, but the author of this book or article then goes on to make a very different point from the one you're trying to make, or perhaps even to disagree with your point. You may desperately wish that the author of that book or article had come out strongly in favor of your point of view so that you could cite them and rely on them in your paper. You know that it would greatly strengthen your own paper and make the case you're trying to make that much more convincing. All of this means it's going to be tempting to paraphrase the source in such a way as to make it sound as though it backs up your idea completely. Or perhaps you might quote part of the source while leaving out a sentence or phrase that changes the meaning. This is what we mean by misrepresenting, distorting, or spinning the contents of someone else's work. It's trying to take their work and use it to support an idea that you favor, but which wasn't really presented in the original source. This is the kind of thing that you see in movie ads. If a reviewer of a movie writes, well, this movie has one or two exciting and dramatic scenes, but most of it is very boring, the newspaper ad that appears the next day is likely to quote the reviewer as having said, exciting and dramatic. Of course, the words exciting and dramatic did appear in the review, but that's not really what the reviewer was saying. That kind of misrepresenting or spinning is done in movie and theater ads, but it mustn't be done in scholarship. Don't give in to this temptation. You can't defend yourself against the charge of partial or misleading quotation by saying to your teacher, well, you know, the author did say the words I quoted. If the author was really trying to say something else and your selective quotation has changed the author's intended meaning, you've committed an academic no-no, and if your teacher notices, you'll be in trouble. Now, does this mean that when you're doing research, if you come across a source that offers useful ideas or information which partly supports your idea, even though that source doesn't wholeheartedly support you, does that mean that you simply can't use that source or that information is off bounds to you? Not necessarily. You can take what you want from a source and put it in the proper context so that it's very clear what you are borrowing and what you agree with and which parts you disagree with. You need to quote the part of the source that supports you and then mention the area of disagreement. In that way, you'll be honestly presenting the point of view of your original source while using what's useful from it to bolster your own case. Let's look at an example, and this will take a few minutes to explain, but follow me closely and you'll see the nature of the dilemma that the writer of a particular research paper might face. And I'm sure you'll find in your own research career that you'll encounter a similar challenge at some point in your work. Let's say that you were researching the history of the famous Supreme Court decision in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. This was the decision that the Supreme Court reached in 1954, which made school segregation illegal. So it was one of the most important decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. Now, while reading accounts of what happened in leading the court to make this decision, you learn something quite interesting, a little footnote from history that most people don't know about. In February 1954, while the Supreme Court was trying to decide the Brown case, Chief Justice Earl Warren, who had just taken over as head of the Supreme Court, was surprised and embarrassed by an incident that involved him and his driver, the chauffeur of his car, who happened to be a black man. Earl Warren and his driver were on a vacation in Virginia, and his driver was unable to find a hotel room that he could stay in. Every hotel that the driver went to ask for a room turned him away and said, well, we don't accept black patrons. So here was someone who worked for the Chief Justice of the United States who couldn't get a hotel room because of segregation. When Earl Warren heard about this, he was embarrassed and upset, and that was one of the things that may have helped convince Warren of how evil segregation was, and therefore this incident may have influenced the court's historic decision. So in reading perhaps a biography of Earl Warren or history of the times, you come across this story and you decide to include this in your paper as an example of the kind of personal experience that can influence a major historical event. However, when you read the biography of Warren where you encountered this particular story and you read the entire chapter, you discover that the author agrees with you only partially. The author makes the point that this incident may have influenced Warren's thinking about segregation, but all by itself it did not change his mind and therefore did not single-handedly produce the court's decision. In fact, the author of the biography makes the point that Warren had actually had serious questions about racial prejudice and segregation for many years, that he had been raised in a somewhat liberal family and had imbibed ideas about race and segregation from an early age, all of which helped to influence the Brown decision, that it wasn't simply this one incident. You want to lean on the incident. You want to point to that as a cause for Warren's decision, but the author of your source doesn't really agree with you. Does this mean you can't use that source? Not really. You can handle the partial disagreement by writing a paragraph for your paper that reads something like this. In his biography of Warren, Jim Newton describes the impact of this event on Warren's thinking about segregation, saying, quote, Warren was a man who felt most strongly what he experienced directly, and on that day he was slapped by this direct confrontation with such an odious practice, close quote. It seems likely that this incident helped to shape Warren's determination to push the court toward its historic decision in Brown. Later, Newton comments that, quote, it was not enough by itself to shock the court into action, close quote, and this is correct. But the incident was one of several personal factors that helped influence Warren's feelings about segregation and, in turn, affected the court's action. Now, you see what a paragraph like this in your paper does. It uses the author of the biography, Jim Newton, to support your argument that this incident was a turning point in Warren's attitude toward segregation. Now, the paragraph also honestly acknowledges the fact that Jim Newton might not completely agree with the argument, that Jim Newton says that other factors also played a role. But nonetheless, you make your own point strongly, and you use Newton's incident and the quote from Newton to back up your point. And the reader of your paper, your teacher in the first instance, can read this paragraph and make an honest judgment. Does the reader agree with you more, or does the reader agree with Jim Newton more? Either way, you've presented all the information honestly and in a scholarly fashion. You've handled the partial disagreement with the source in a fair way, rather than trying to twist the source to hammer home your point inaccurately. So rather than leaving out the fact that there's a disagreement, you mention the disagreement and let the reader be the judge. Reading a paragraph like this in your paper, your teacher is likely to come away saying, this is a very scholarly, scrupulous, and honest way of dealing with this disagreement. I appreciate what the student is doing, and this is a paper that's going to end up getting a high grade. So when you find yourself in disagreement with a source, don't give in to the temptation to quote selectively or to twist the information in your source. Instead, present all the information fairly and honestly, give your own point of view, your own interpretation, and let the reader decide which point of view he or she agrees with. Now, in this program, we've only scratched the surface of the many issues that relate to how you read, study, and use research sources. There's much more to cover, and we're going to begin that in the next program. There, we'll provide you with a set of specific tools for mastering a vital skill that surprisingly few students are experts at, namely crafting clear and useful notes that will help make drafting, revising, formatting, and polishing your research paper easier and faster. Thanks for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in the next program in this series.
If you or someone you know needs to learn English as a second language, starting from the very beginning, then video-aided instructions Learning English Steps 1, 2, 3 is exactly what you need. This 11-hour, 83-lesson course will teach you how to start using English in your everyday life, at school, and on the job. This developmental program gives you lots of practice in the basics of listening, speaking, reading, and writing in English. Plus, we teach you important vocabulary words in every lesson. It's quick, it's easy, and it really works. Visit us online at videoaidedinstruction.com for more information about learning English Steps 1, 2, 3. Don't let poor English skills stand in the way of your success. Mastering English unlocks a world of opportunities. Let video-aided instruction give you the key.